We're going to go straight to Professor Boston, who's with us in the room at the moment, and who I understand has an important event after this that he needs to go to. So thank you for taking the time. We've got 10 minutes for your submission, and we've got 15 minutes for your submission, inclusive of any questions. So I'll give you the time now. Kia ora.
All right. Well, kia ora, morena, everyone. Ko Jonathan Boston aho. Tamati, great to see you again.
Yes.
Tamati has studied at Victoria University recently, and it was great to have you in the class. And I'm sorry you're standing down, but hopefully for a good future.
Yes, thank you.
So look, the issues around climate change adaptation are obviously huge, and I'm delighted your committee is exploring them, and I wish you well in that endeavour. Let me just offer a few sort of caveats at the moment. So I'm involved in a number of processes, and I need to be therefore mindful of certain confidentiality associated with them. So first of all, I'm a member of what's called the Expert Working Group on Managed Retreat for the Ministry for the Environment. It's chaired by Sir Terence Arnold, former Supreme Court judge, previously by Dame Shana Elias, the Chief Justice. She's had to stand down for personal reasons. And that committee is due to deliver a report to the government by the end of June. And I would encourage you as a committee to take an interest in what we have to say when that report is completed. I'm also part of what's called the Environmental Defence Society project on climate change adaptation, and to that end, I have written a report which I think has been distributed to members, but perhaps I could just distribute the executive summary, if that's all right, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. It has a one-page summary of the executive summary, so that will be, I hope, helpful.
You're talking our language.
In this context, as you'll be aware, the government is committed to introducing legislation on climate change adaptation before the House rises later this year. And my understanding is that legislation is currently being drafted. My understanding also is that probably it will be an initial piece of legislation that will be followed up in future years with further elements. So it's going to be a progressive developmental kind of process. So let me just offer you a very few quick comments and then take your questions. So as we think about the impacts of climate change, which we've witnessed tragically in the last few months in this country, we'll be mindful that all members of the community here and globally are going to be affected by climate change, and that will affect Māori and non-Māori alike. And that there will be a need for the government to have general policies that affect all citizens. But I also think there would be a very good case for having bespoke arrangements for Māori. And this is something that I think your committee should give serious attention to over the coming months. The reason for suggesting that we will need bespoke arrangements obviously relate to the fact that many Māori communities are going to be vulnerable to sea level rise over the coming century and beyond. And as sea levels rise even more later the century and into the next century, ever more communities will be vulnerable. As you'll be aware, something like 80% of 800 marae in the country are located in low-lying areas, and many of them are vulnerable to both riverine flooding and or sea level rise. And not just marae, but also many culturally important sites. Urupa, among other things, absolutely. So there's some very precious things that are going to be vulnerable that will require, in my view, distinctive legislative arrangements. And quite apart from that, there may well be areas that are affected that were part of treaty settlements, and therefore there may be a need for some renegotiation of treaty settlements, or for other land, for example, to be made available in return for the land that will be lost. When we come to bespoke arrangements, there are really two really critical areas that I think it's going to be important for this committee to focus on. The first will be the planning processes that will be used in the process of making decisions about whether there will be managed retreat and then how that managed retreat will be undertaken. So right as we speak, government officials and ministers are thinking about the kinds of planning processes that might be appropriate for managed retreat generally. And then I think there will be a need for specific consideration of what distinctive processes for participation, engagement with hapu and iwi and so on will be appropriate for Māori communities that are affected. And I don't have any great wisdom to offer there, but these are matters that I think your committee should certainly address. The second will be in relation to compensatory arrangements. As we speak, the government is obviously reflecting on how to compensate those property owners, the private property owners particularly, that have been devastated by the recent floods in situations where it doesn't make sense to rebuild. So there will need to be some kind of property buyouts on some basis, yet to be determined. And these are matters that the expert working group has been giving considerable attention to, as have government officials over recent months. But aside from sort of general compensatory arrangements, I think there may well be a very good case for bespoke compensatory arrangements for Māori, for iwi hapu, particularly where marae might have to be moved, or where culturally significant sites may be vulnerable. So those are two areas where, as we think about climate change adaptation and particularly managed retreat, which I'm focused on right now, those are two areas where this committee, I think, will need to be actively engaged and contribute to the policy processes over the coming months. So I hope that's just useful kind of laying out the territory, and I'm very happy to try and answer some of your questions as well as I can, but my colleague behind me, Professor Irons, will probably be better able to answer those questions.
There's another seat over here.
I have a separate time allocated next time. I won't take his.
Question from Aidan Williams.
Thank you so much for joining the committee, Professor. Can I take you to the part of your work which is on the processes for engagement with Māori communities? Can we talk about that? So can you help me think about how a locally led response, and a lot of the research is that and what we learned from Christchurch is that local communities must lead that. But there's a sort of competing principle, one of your principles around avoiding a situation where there might be moral hazard and where people are incentivized to sort of game the system. How do you make sure that a locally led response doesn't silo iwi from thinking just about their own needs is kind of what I'm thinking about here. And those iwi that are most affected in say Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti also obviously have an interest in their human members who live in Auckland or who live in Wellington. Can you talk to me about sort of how we might approach those competing principles and how we might just approach competing principles generally?
Yes. I'll try. All right. So look, the first thing we need to recognise as we focus on adaptation and particularly managed retreat is that this is going to be exceptionally difficult, however it is done. People's homes, livelihoods, culture, history is going to be at stake. And these are things that people will feel deeply, whether you're Māori or non-Māori. These are going to be exceptionally difficult issues. The second will be that we need somehow to balance local initiative and kind of bottom-up arrangements with the fact that there are going to have to be some kind of top-down decisions, because whoever's funding, for example, any managed retreat, won't want to fund something which they don't feel is justified. And that will be primarily the central government, because local government won't have the resources in most cases to be the primary funder. So that's the second thing. We're going to have to try and balance local and central interplay, which means there's going to be a need for very rigorous and deep conversations and consultation. The third point would be, we do need, in my view, to think about this both in terms of general arrangements for the population as a whole, and then, as I made clear previously, bespoke arrangements. When it comes to the general arrangements for sort of planning, as you will be aware, the government is embarking on really major changes in resource management legislation. And if my understanding of what's proposed is correct, then we will have regional spatial strategies, we will have regional regulatory plans, And we will have then probably some planning mechanism at the local level, which might be local adaptation strategies or local adaptation plans. And we're going to have to think very carefully about how these different instruments fit together. Then we're going to have to think very carefully about the precise sort of issues that are going to arise when a community is deemed to be kind of at risk. So there's going to have to be careful thought about determining the level of risk that will require some adaptive response, which might be managed retreat, or it might be protective structures, okay? So there's going to have to be some, serious analysis, therefore, of the kind of risk assessment processes, and then who decides on what basis that something needs to be done. And that goes to the heart of your question about, well, what is the role of local communities in that? I think my view would be, local communities have to be deeply involved, but at the same time, we can't have a situation in which a local community is unwilling to accept sort of scientific reality and obstructs change in a way that then puts people's lives, livelihoods and other things at risk. So this is going to be very difficult. So coming to the principles, if I can do it that way, the first principle, which I think is critically important, is that we must protect human life. We must avoid situations as arose in Tarawhiti and Hawke's Bay, where people's lives are clearly at risk and where people have lost their lives. And with sea level rise, this is going to become, over the century, ever more a serious risk. So that's critical, okay? Secondly, it seems to me we have to have this general principle of community responsibility for natural hazards, as we have done with earthquakes. So in my view, we must do with sea level rise. Thirdly, I think we have to recognise the importance of private property rights, but also Māori rights and interests. So there's those sorts of things have to be taken very seriously, and that has led me to the view that we will need to have some sort of financial compensatory arrangements for the loss of private property and the loss of Māori land and related matters. Look, I could go on. I mean, I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but there's going to be there's a range of principles. They're sometimes going to be in tension, and we're going to have to work through this challenge as well as we can. And look, it is an unprecedented challenge. Humanity has never faced this kind of problem before. We've never had to face the prospect of moving thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out of harm's way.
Can I just test whether I've understood the sort of structure that you set out there, different instruments? So just trying to understand, would you suggest a level of risk that sort of triggered the engagement of local adaptation plans, like centrally setting a level at which you've been flooded X times, there is X risk to life? That would be a centrally decided thing, and then you would engage local decision making around that.
So under the proposed resource management legislation, there will be these regional spatial strategies. And these strategies, as I understand it, and Professor Irons may be able to give you better chapter and verse on this, but my understanding is that they will be designed, among other things, to identify areas that are going to be vulnerable over the coming decades to climate change impacts, including sea level rise. So you'll have that initial high-level identification of areas. Then you'll have the regional regulatory plans, the NBA, the natural and built environment plans, that will be the main sort of planning instrument generally. But then it seems to me, because of the really tricky issues that arise when we start talking about managed retreat, I think there will be a need for a local kind of strategy or plan, which might be for a small town or community. It might be for a whole suburb like South Dunedin, and it might spread over many, many decades with sequential movement. And then you're going to have procedures and processes around how these plans are developed and how they're actioned. And that will obviously include big questions about, well, who can be involved at what point, what sort of assistances are going to be for community participation, what are the specific distinctive arrangements for iwi hapu where Māori rights and interests are clearly at stake, and so on. And forgive me, I haven't, all these details haven't been worked through yet. Some of them will be almost certainly laid out in the climate change adaptation bill in due course. For discussion, obviously.
Ka pai.
Kia ora, Jonathan, kōrua ko Catherine, lovely to see you again 25 years later. You've kept some of your hair, I haven't.
Only a little bit.
Yeah, you're really important cultural issues like hahunga training alone for this will take forever. I don't know if you know what hahunga is. What is it? It's basically lifting bodies, resuming and lifting bodies out of urupā and putting them in different places, resuming them.
Yes.
But the question that I wanted to ask is a bit unrelated to that. It's around population policy and how that affects your current assessment of that. Should we be curating one, or should we just leave that alone as a no-go zone? Because that is a real fundamental issue when you talk about infrastructure, the impacts of sea level rise and other things. So I'm just wondering if you've given any thought to that.
So,
well,
I have at various points.
I want to talk about population policy.
Yeah. So look, you can think about this globally, nationally, sort of subnationally. First of all, I think it's a very tricky area from a policy point of view because, again, you've got, conflicting values and priorities. You want, couples to be able to have children if they wish to have children and not to have children if they don't wish to have children and so on. And you've got, in the New Zealand context, roughly 1 million citizens or potential citizens offshore, in addition to those who live here. And then there's the issue of our responsibilities to the Pacific communities that are going to be, well, potentially annihilated by climate change. So, what I would say very quickly is that we must try and avoid development in areas that are going to be vulnerable to sea level rise or more severe flooding. That would be a first thing. So that is, in effect, part of a population strategy, at least at the local level. You're stopping people living in particular areas. Other than that, look, forgive me, I've not thought through all the issues around the national population policy.
I'm just saying, maybe this is one of the reflections that as a committee we have to think about as well. Because if we've got less land to build on and more people coming from whether or not that's natural increase in migration or citizens coming back, that's more people in less area.
Yes, and I also think New Zealand is going to be increasingly attractive to many people living in parts of the world that are going to be even more seriously afflicted by climate change than we are. Those living in very, very hot climates, those living in areas that become prone to very, very severe droughts, and of course, wealthy people who see New Zealand as a kind of a bolt hole.
Thank you so much, Professor. We will let you go. We've gone over time.
All right.
But we're in the capable hands.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Okay.
Good
Yes.
luck
Okay.
to you.
Thank you.